Hello everyone, welcome back. We are going to continue with our Unit 1 Introduction to Environmental Science. Thanks for joining me. So last time we talked about how we could go about living sustainably in our current environment, and we also talked about exactly what the environment is, and we also talked about, what ecology and environmental science is, and also, how we are interested in learning more about our Earth. So today's focus is going to be specifically on resources, and those can be anything from, renewable resources like wind or solar to those that are non-renewable, so things like oil and coal. And so we're going to talk about exactly what a resource is, in addition to a few other things. So these are our goals for today. So by the end of this video, you should be able to tell the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources, in addition to providing examples of both of those. I'd also like you to be able to summarize the concept of what's called the tragedy of the commons, in addition to relating it to current global examples. And last but not least, you should be able to describe the term ecological footprint, and with an assignment that you should have completed already or will be completing, I'd like you to be able to assess your own ecological footprint. And again, per usual, here is our vocabulary list. And these are all of the words that are going to be mentioned in today's video. So moving forward, a resource is specifically anything that we can obtain from the environment in order to satisfy our needs and wants. And so these can range from food items, like we've got here up in the grocery basket, water resources, whether it's water that we're drinking or using for laundry or watering our lawn, anything. It includes resources we obtain to build shelter, whether it's just this simple little lean-to or whatever is used to construct houses and buildings and apartments. It also revolves around our transportation needs, areas of our world that we utilize for extracurricular activities, like if you see a local park that has soccer fields and basketball courts, okay? And it also involves a lot of discussion revolving around these resources, okay? And so that is the overarching umbrella term of a resource. And we're going to talk about a little bit of a different type of resource in just a little bit. So resources can often be categorized as 2 to 3 things. One, they can be categorized as being perpetual, renewable, or non-renewable. And we're going to talk about those in just a second. In addition, these resources can either be directly or indirectly available. What does it mean, indirectly available? Well, this means those specific resources only become useful if we put in a little bit of elbow grease and also have some really awesome technology that allows us to obtain that resource. So, for example, there's a process called fracking. Fracking is where natural gas is obtained through stores deep in bedrock, and it's not easily accessible unless you have the right tools. And so fracking is something we're probably going to talk more about later on down the road when we talk about waste and also our water resources. But you can certainly Google it if you're curious to learn more. So a perpetual resource is one of those categories that any resource can fall into, but it's a little bit different than a renewable resource. A perpetual resource are those that are essentially inexhaustible on a human time scale. The sun is a great example. If you think about it, the sun has been around for quite a long time, millennia to be exact, and I don't foresee it going out in my lifetime. In fact, it probably won't go out in your lifetime either. And so it's beyond the human time scale. It's been around for an extremely long period of time. That's why it's called perpetual. Other examples might be considered wind. The sun is one of the main reasons we do have wind, and also water currents. In addition, the amount of water that we see on our planet has been around since the beginning of our planet. It's constantly going through a cycle of being evaporated and then condensing and then falling as rain or some type of precipitation. And so that amount of water doesn't change. So that is another example of perpetual. With that in mind, those examples that I just gave you of sun, wind, and water are all examples of renewable resources as well. They're categorized as such because they can be replenished pretty quickly compared to some other resources on our planet, and for the most part, we consider them to be natural resources. Now, non-renewable resources are also natural resources, but they're a little bit different. Now, with regards to our renewable resources, in the examples that I have here, we have water, trees and plant life. Even animals are considered to be a natural resource, as well as clean air. Now, depending on how well we utilize our resources and how efficient we are with them, and if we try to maintain sustainable societies, we can keep those resources around for a long time and allow them to replenish themselves. However, if we're not careful, these renewable resources can become non-renewable. That's where this term comes in, environmental degradation. This particular process happens when we exceed a renewable resource's natural replacement rate. So essentially, we're using these resources faster than they can be replaced, and the amount that's available decreases. Okay, and so if I were to think of, a forest as a renewable resource, because they are trees, they're plants, they can grow back from seeds. But if I'm cutting down trees faster than I'm planting them, because it does take them decades to grow as big as a huge tall tree. But, if you're not taking care of those, if you're not properly following a tree's growing cycle, and you're cutting more of them down than are growing in its place, well then, that particular region of forest can become a non-renewable resource. And the environment can become degraded, or it can kind of revert from a natural healthy state into a non-healthy state. Which is where we come to this term. So tragedy of the commons, this is something that you've actually already experienced. And if I were to just, bring it down into simple terms, this process, if you will, is an unregulated exploitation of a resource that leads to the depletion of that resource. So essentially, this means that no one is really monitoring who's using the resource or who's using how much of said resource. And so because no one's really paying attention to how much is being used and where all these resources are going, the amount of the resources goes down. Now, the person who came up with this idea is a gentleman by the name of Garrett Hardin, and this was in the late 1960s. And essentially, he observed that resource users are using these resources, and they're tempted to increase their use until eventually that resource is gone. And so I like to think of an example of a field where you have sheep. So imagine that there are 5 farmers that all use this particular field to graze their sheep. In this case, the resource is grass, because the grass is food for the sheep. Now, each farmer has a different number of sheep, but because they're using the field as a common resource, it's kind of like, so-and-so is also using the field, so I don't have to take care of it. It's kind of like the bystander effect. If you notice, there's an accident on the freeway and you think, someone else is going to call the police to help them. It's kind of the same idea. And so these farmers, they're not really monitoring how much of the resources are being used by the other people, and they don't take the initiative to take care of that resource. And so that resource, the grass, then goes down, which means if there's not enough food to go around, the amount of sheep that those farmers have, they could start to go down too. So essentially, the farmers are only going to be harming themselves in addition to their sheep that depend on the grass. And so I'd like you to think about possible solutions to this idea, but I'm going to continue. So if you have any ideas, definitely share them with me. But I'm going to move on to the next deal here, which is the ecological footprint. So an ecological footprint is similar to the way it sounds, but first we focus on the fact that affluence, which means how much money you have, your wealth, it increases how much you consume. So the more money you have, the more resources you're going to use. And so ecological footprint just means the environmental impact of a person or a population. So how many resources are you using? And so a lot of times people don't realize how many resources they're actually using just for them as an individual. But when you multiply that by hundreds or thousands or millions in a population of a country, that footprint can be rather large. And so when we talk about what area we're impacting, we're looking at the area of biologically productive land and water. So a lot of times we realize the land that's around where we live, but you always, well, not always, you probably don't take into consideration the bodies of water that are around, even if they're very minimal. In addition, with the ecological footprint, we also have to consider that whatever raw resources we obtain, we have to dispose of or recycle the waste. And so that also plays into this idea of the ecological footprint. So it makes sense that people that live in nations that are richer, so we call those developed nations, they tend to have a much larger ecological footprint than nations that are not quite so well off. So those are called developing countries. So if you were to compare, say, the United States to a country in Africa, you would see a vast difference. And so if we look, these graphs here depict some of those comparisons I mentioned. So the total footprint up here at the top of the United States is much greater than, say, Japan, which is crazy considering that Japan is a teeny tiny island compared to the United States. Now, if you look even down here, now this is a little bit different. This is only focusing on hectares per person, which is land area. And so the United States still has the largest footprint, but Japan's footprint is a little higher. Well, much higher than the previous graph. But India is much lower, which I find astounding because India has one of the largest populations on the planet, much larger than the United States. And so in this final graph over here on the right, you can see that since the 1960s, when this graph was developed, not the 1960s, excuse me, when data was taken, you can see that our ecological footprint as a human population has drastically increased up into the early 2000s, and it's probably gone up even to this ever-present day in 2015, and we've surpassed the capacity that Earth has in order for us to still have access to many of the resources we depend on. So our current ecological footprint exceeds Earth's biological capacity in order to provide for us. Now, there are ways for us to change that, and we're going to talk about some of those ways in future lessons. So this is where we come to our final discussion point, non-renewable resources. So yes, a lot of the resources we use do replenish, but there are those that don't. And so a non-renewable resource is one that exists in a fixed quantity or a stock, so a stockpile within the Earth's crust. And they can be depleted much faster than they are formed. So they take really a long time to form, and we're using them much quicker than that can happen. So some really good examples I'll show you on the next slide. But first, one thing I want to emphasize is with these particular items that we consider non-renewable, it's always a really good idea if you can recycle or reuse those items to help extend that particular resource. So for example, you can take a whole bunch of aluminum pop cans and you can create a solar panel. It's kind of a DIY science project. And I bet you could Google it online and find out how to do it. It's actually really neat. So some examples of non-renewable resources are energy resources like coal, gas, and oil. We also look at metallic mineral resources, so things like copper, gold, magnetite, those guys in the picture there. In addition to non-metallic mineral resources, so things like sand, silt, and clay. You don't necessarily think of these as resources, at least in my mind. I'm like, sand isn't a resource, it's on a beach. But sand is often used to make glass, and glass is used in a number of things in our lives. And so thank you so much for watching this second video. If you have any questions, shoot me an email.